Hello and welcome. Our selection of readings this time goes to Sunday, which of course celebrates the resurrection of Jesus, and is Easter Sunday. And for those of you who only watch this on Easter, happy Easter. Actually, there are two possible gospel readings. One would come from the Easter Vigil, which is celebrated on Saturday, and one from John, which is celebrated on Sunday. So let me give you the Sunday readings for Easter. The first would be from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, verse 34a, then verses 37 through 43. When it comes to the second reading, there are two choices. The first is from Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And the other choice is from Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6b through 8. And then the gospel. The gospel for Easter Sunday is from John chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. And from the Easter Vigil, which is also an option that could be used, is from Matthew chapter 29, verses 1 through 10. So all of those are to show that it depends on when you are celebrating and how you want to look at things. Let's look at the gospel tradition according to John, which is the assigned gospel for Easter Sunday itself. So, John's gospel begins his narration of the resurrection of Jesus by Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb early in the morning while it is still dark. It is perhaps interesting to follow one of the themes that John likes, the idea of darkness and light. So Mary Magdalene still comes in, the dark, okay? Which, as you might notice, was a kind of anomaly. A single woman walking in the dark by herself. Now, that in itself is really an anomaly. Why was she doing this? Not, as we mentioned, to anoint the body of Jesus. That had already been done, you remember, by Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. So the reason she comes must be for personal reasons, perhaps grief at the loss of someone who has meant a lot in her life. When she arrives, she notices that the tomb door is open and the tomb is empty. She leaves. She doesn't go in at this point, but leaves and immediately goes and tells the disciples what has happened. Peter and the disciple, now one translation says the disciple whom Jesus loved, one says the other disciple. In either case, that person is unnamed. Both head for the tomb. They not simply walk, but they run to the tomb. The first one, disciple whom Jesus, the other disciple, one whom Jesus loved, gets there first. He looks into the tomb, but he doesn't enter. He waits. Peter enters, and when he enters the tomb, he notices that there are wrappings nicely done. Those that did the body at the foot, and those that encompass the face at the head. The other disciple enters, and seeing, he believes. Now what does he see? It's an empty tomb. But he now emerges really as the first disciple in the tradition, according to John, to come to believe the resurrection of Jesus. They enter, they leave, and that's the story. Now, the story continues, and what we're going to do here, just for our analysis this morning, is to finish this whole little section. Not all of this will be part of the gospel that you hear. John has really divided the work here in chapter 20, which technically is the last chapter of the fourth gospel, although there's an additional chapter, chapter 21. We've talked about this before, which talks about another visit of Jesus to the disciples. Here in chapter 20, the first 18 verses deal with the disciples and with Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Then they talk about Easter evening, in which Jesus appears to the disciples. This will be the gospel next time. See, so what I have to do is kind of analyze a little bit a part of what we can as we reflect on it this morning, and that's chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. Then the third part is 8 days later. Jesus again appears to the disciples. This time, Thomas, who was missing on Easter Eve, is now present 8 days later. And then there is a preliminary conclusion to the chapter 20, which is our verses 30 through 31. We won't hear all of those, but I did want to kind of put into perspective this final chapter of the Johannine Gospel. All right. As I mentioned, Peter certainly is a witness to the empty tomb. Now, as we have noticed on other occasions, and just quickly to put it again into perspective, there are two traditions which deal with the resurrection of Jesus. The first of the traditions is found in the letter of Paul to the Corinthians in chapter 15, in which he speaks about the fact that the risen Jesus has been seen by certain people. And you can check that out. I think it has already appeared in another reading, but just in reference here, that Peter, and this is the first person, Paul, of course, at times calls Peter Cephas, has seen Jesus. Then he appears to the 12. Then he appears to 500 all at once. And then Paul mentions many of them are still with us, although some of them have died. Then he appears to James. Then he appears to all of the apostles. And then Paul says, finally, as one kind of born out of time, out of sequence, he appears to me. So, and all this in the letter to the Corinthians, which appears sometime in the early 50s of the Common Era. Now keep in mind that the Gospels are written well after that, and they begin with a second tradition, the tradition of the empty tomb. In and of itself, the empty tomb doesn't really prove a resurrection, but it is certainly one of the two major uses of information supporting the understanding of Jesus' resurrection. Even the terminology used varies. In some of the traditions, it says Jesus has been raised up by God, by the Father. Others say Jesus rose from the dead. Now, even there, the emphasis might be considered to be a little different. If God raises up Jesus, then the emphasis is on God. If Jesus kind of raises himself from the dead, well, that tells, again, another emphasis on the ability of Jesus and who Jesus is. Now, what's the point when one looks inside and sees the neatly wrapped clothing, the bandages on one side and the linen cloth on the other side? Keep in mind, and this was a story that we saw not last Sunday, but the fifth Sunday of Lent, where Jesus had, you remember, called Lazarus back from the tomb. And when Lazarus stepped out of the tomb, he was bandaged and clothed head to foot. And he had to have someone untie his bandages and take the cloth off from his face. So in order for Lazarus to walk, to move, someone had to help him. And you can kind of picture them unwrapping the bandages that covered Lazarus. In this case, nicely folded, nicely setting there, what is this telling us? That Jesus needed no help, that he himself rose. See, so this is again a characteristic that the fourth gospel writer often likes to use, gives a kind of preview of something and then brings it to a new understanding later on. So there is here a connection between the kind of unraveling, if you want, of the bandages of death from Lazarus to the unraveling, of Jesus coming to new life. All right, so all of that might explain a little bit the importance of what either Peter noticed, but does he come to believe? Or the other disciple who steps in and comes to believe. And in John's gospel, he is the first to believe in the resurrection. Now, what's not here, but which continues in this gospel story, and that's why the editors kind of move it around a little bit, but sometimes in taking things out of context, miss the whole story. They certainly have an important part of the story, but perhaps the whole story. And what the rest of the story is that Mary Magdalene is back again. Now, it's not told us what happened to her. Remember, she had seen the empty tomb, gone told the disciples, they had run there. How did she get there? Did she walk? Did she run? We don't know, except that she's there. And now she looks into the tomb and she sees an angel. Now, she doesn't know exactly. Wouldn't you be a little surprised now to find someone in the tomb who wasn't there, by the way, when Peter and the other disciple came? And says, she says to him, what have you done with the body of Jesus? So the basic understanding, perhaps both of the disciples and of Mary, is that the body of Jesus is gone because someone has taken it. There has been what we would probably call grave robbery or something else, all right? When Mary turns around, she notices a figure there, and she assumes that he is the gardener. Now, important to notice that in the Johannine Gospel, the tomb into which Jesus is laid is in a garden. Garden stories, of course, are important, keeping in mind that in the beginning, God had created the garden, remember in Genesis? So again, here is a garden where a new form of life is going to be revealed. Mary thinks that the person she sees is the gardener. She says, look, what have you done with him? Tell me, I will take his body and I will take care of it. So again, the assumption that Mary has, and it seems to be the assumption of the others, is that some kind of robbery, as I mentioned, had taken place. Then the figure says, Mary. And in that moment, she discovers that the figure there is none other than Jesus, and says, Rabboni, Master, Lord. And it's a beautiful and technically powerful scene of recognition. And Rabboni here, by the way, would be the Aramaic tongue. And it is really a kind of form of endearment that she says. Jesus then says, do not hold on to me. Now, some translators have said, don't touch me, but that really is an unfortunate translation of the word. But Jesus is saying to Mary, look, you must let me go. Now, what is it? That Jesus has not yet completed the process of resurrection, or the way in which Mary and the disciples had thought about Jesus must now be looked at and viewed in a different way. So you can't hold on to the position that you had before. So Johannine theology, as we've noticed on a number of occasions, has a number of different ways of interpretation which are important. Jesus' process of glorification has not yet happened, and you need to come now to Easter evening, next time when we see that will happen. Mary is now commissioned to take the good news that Jesus lives, that he has been raised. And some commenting on the role of Mary here, of course, honor her with a wonderful title, The Apostle to the Apostles. She is the first to bring the news of the resurrection of Jesus to the apostles, who, of course, at the moment of Jesus' death, had not been there. They had, of course, left. Mary Magdalene was mentioned in all of the gospel traditions as having been there on Calvary, when Jesus was executed. All right, so that pretty much ends the first part of chapter 20. This is kind of the background for the story of Jesus' resurrection that John tells. And Mary Magdalene here, of course, as I suggest, is the wonderful first model of disciple who believes. Now, she believes because she sees the risen Lord. Later on, Jesus will say, as we will hear next time in chapter 20, blessed are they who have not seen it and who have believed. All right, but at this point, clearly, she is privileged to receive the risen Jesus in the garden, the new garden, the garden that had been a place from which, the story goes, even Adam had been driven out. Now into the new garden comes Jesus with new life. All right, with that in mind, some comment now on the gospel tradition of Matthew, which again could be used or is used on the feast of the Easter Vigil, which, as you know, is the major Easter Mass or celebration of the whole liturgical year. It is a very beautiful and, yes, from some point of view, has a number of different parts to it, as you know, a number of readings, a blessing of the great candle, which stays lit throughout the Easter season and throughout other important moments in Christian life, like baptism and funerals. It is the night in which those who have been preparing for baptism are baptized, so new members are brought into the faith family, and then Eucharist is observed. All right, now in this story, Matthew develops his story of the resurrection, again in 4 scenes. The first scene is the women experience at the tomb. All of this is in chapter 28. This would be verses 1 through 7. There is a brief encounter that they have with the risen Jesus. That's in verses 8 through 10. Then the Jewish leaders attempt to suppress the story of the resurrection. This is told again in chapter 11 through 15. And then the appearance of Jesus is going to take place to the disciples in Galilee. And that ends chapter 20. And we won't hear that until the celebration of the feast of the Ascension, in which what was known as the Great Commission is given, and they are told to go and bring the good news to all people. All right, that's a quick summary of chapter 20. Now, what's the experience? It perhaps is interesting to notice And in this regard, Matthew is somewhat consistent with Mark and Luke, that there are women who witness the most important events in the sequence, namely of Jesus' death, descent, and rising. The women, 3 women, stand at a distance and see Jesus die on the cross. They stand and watch and notice where Jesus has been buried. And now they come to the tomb of Jesus. They come, however, in Matthew, not to anoint the body of Jesus. This has been done already. They notice that it's been done. By the way, women are pretty perceptive about a number of these details, and for various reasons, Matthew, of course, includes this. Now, it's only in, and here are some characteristics, and that's what we'd like to look at a little bit today, which are unique in the gospel tradition of Matthew. One of them is the use of earthquakes. Now, it's also interesting that in the Good Friday narration, there is an earthquake when Jesus dies. The curtain in the temple is split. Again, that may well represent that the presence of God is now for everyone and not simply hidden away in a special place. That, again, is another kind of analysis that those who study this point out. But there's an earthquake, and in the earthquake, many arise, and the saints travel around. There's no explanation for that, but it's interesting. Already, the resurrection in some ways is prefigured in this first of earthquakes. All right? Now, I mentioned that it's a kind of characteristic of the Matthean tradition. The women are at the tomb. They don't talk about how the rock is going to be rolled away, but when they come to the tomb, they see that the stone has been rolled away. And how does it get rolled away? An earthquake. See, it certainly, I suppose, those of you who kind of say, well, there's a natural explanation, might explain, would an earthquake roll a rock away so that the tomb door would be open? I don't know. Anyway, it certainly is interesting, isn't it? All right, now, what is important here, and kind of to move the story around a little bit to remember, and it was only in this gospel that on the day after Jesus' death, the leaders, and there always is this tension, we have noticed this and will notice this as we move through Matthew's story through the year, between the leadership and Jesus. And they go to Pilate and they say, look, the guy said that when he was alive, he would in 3 days be gone from the tomb. Most likely his disciples heard this, although that's kind of funny because they had all run away. But they will come back and steal the body of Jesus out of the tomb, and then they will go and say, oh, he has risen. So what we're asking you, Pilate, is to put a guard there so that nobody can do this. Pilate, of course, who up to this point has really much been convinced about the innocence of Jesus. Remember, I think we mentioned this last time when we looked at the Passion narrative, had washed his hands of the whole affair, had said that I don't want to be responsible for the death of this innocent man. If you want the tomb guarded, do it yourself, okay? You have your own forces. And so what is done is the tomb is sealed, and according to the tradition, the official, now whether it was the Roman seal or whether it was the seal of the Jewish leaders, we don't know, seal much like, you know, when you use the wax on a piece of paper and then put the stamp on top of it, making it official and closing it. So that had been, of course, what Matthew notices had been the tomb of Jesus, done to the tomb of Jesus. So now there are soldiers there. Now, who are these soldiers? Are they Roman soldiers, or are, as I mentioned, soldiers of the leadership? In other words, would they be government soldiers, or would they be just kind of ordinary soldiers from the Jewish family? Not that it's terribly important, it's just the point is being made that the tomb is being guarded. All right, so the earthquake happens, the stone is rolled away, the angel tells the women, and it's interesting here that, look, Jesus is risen, as he told you, and he goes before you into the Galilee. Go and tell the disciples this message, that they will see him in the Galilee. All right? So apparently they start off, and now as they're starting off, it's very interesting. Jesus appears to the women as they are on their mission to the disciples. And there is a little brief encounter. They fall down, they honor Jesus, and then they, in a certain way, in Matthew's story, are the first to see the risen Jesus. So it's interesting the role that women play in the gospel tradition of Matthew. Now, just as an aside here, keep in mind, this is not that the responsibility for the news of the resurrection falls in the hand of women. Keep in mind that this is still a very patristic society governed by men. So what are the role of women? We've noticed, talked about this before, belong to the category of the poor. And it is to the poor that Jesus, for the first time, is revealed as risen. Keep in mind the whole, again, of Matthew's story. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So in this case, it's not a feminist idea, but it is really an understanding that the first good news to the community of the resurrection goes to the poor. And in that regard, that's who the women represent. So I just kind of bring that in as a kind of reflection. The other story that follows, and it's not really told here, is that the guards now come back to and here we really think it's the Jewish leaders, and tell them what has happened. And the Jewish leaders say, all right, here's the way you're going to handle this. You're going to tell those who are interested and asked that while you were sleeping, the disciples came, snatched the body of Jesus, and took it away. Now, the point, and this would be a point that when you probably would have thought of this, and St. Augustine later on would say, it's interesting, how do sleeping soldiers see what's happening? I know some of you probably say that to your children, that you could see while you, but anyway. But here's the story you are to tell. The leaders say to the soldiers, just that the body of Jesus has been chosen. Now, and they are paid off. Now, it's interesting, they are given a large sum of money. So they are given, and here again is a theme that runs a little bit in Matthew's story. Remember, Judas has gotten 30 pieces, he had thrown them back. But here, the most important story gets a large sum of money. The exact amount is not told, but Matthew concludes by saying that's the story that's being told even in his own time. Now, maybe, keeping in mind that Matthew's story is written in the mid-'80s and onward, was that the story that in some quarters of Judaism, the story was being told, that we don't know. So that would be the gospel that is used, as I say, for the great Easter Vigil. Matthew's interpretation of the resurrection. There are no consistently same stories connected with the resurrection. All four of the evangelists, as you might notice, take their own particular take on things and interpretation. We have looked at two of them this time, that of Matthew and that of John, but in all cases we believe and we know that in the graciousness of God, Jesus is raised, and it is the risen Jesus whom we honor and celebrate when we gather as his family around his table. Thank you for being with us, and to all a very blessed, happy Easter.